Nerub-ar Palace is the first raid in the War Within, and now that we've had a chance to test all the bosses at least once, some on Heroic and some on Mythic, I wanted to give a bit of a preview, a bit of feedback, and just generally share some thoughts and predictions about the upcoming raid tier and the bosses within that raid. Let's dive in, but first, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, so just to give an overview, I think that the tanking mechanics in this raid are generally fairly simple. You know, usually tanking in raids boils down to taunt this, taunt that, swap it back and forth between the two tanks. Sometimes there is a bit of complexity with the way that you use defensive cooldowns to mitigate a boss mechanic, or using external cooldowns to like fully nullify some sort of boss mechanic, something like that. And there is a little bit of that in this raid, not a massive amount, not every single boss, but definitely some. I think there's a little bit of variety in here, enough to kind of keep things fresh and not feel like every single boss is taunt on 3 stacks or taunt on 1 stack, you know, not totally boring. I'm pretty happy with it. I would say, just generally speaking, I do feel like the raid has a pretty consistent form of collective punishment, though. Like, everybody has to soak this thing or you all die. A lot of that kind of thing going on. For the most part, I think this raid is full of single target fights. There are some add phases, but mostly it's single target. There's very little 2-target cleave, or like, you'll have brief add phases as sort of a boss intermission. You'll kill all the adds, and then you'll transition back into single target. Mostly single target in terms of how things are looking so far throughout testing. So now let's just go ahead and take a look at the bosses one by one. We've gotten to test 7 of the 8 bosses, and we're just going to start with the very first boss, Ulgrax the Devourer. So I don't want this to be a full-fledged guide, you know, I don't want this video to be like an hour long, so I'll just kind of cover what I consider like the main tank mechanics, and then kind of the broad strokes of the fight. So for Ulgrax, the main tank swap is very basic. You know, he hits the tank with a strike, it applies a debuff. The debuff is basically a stacking mortal strike that very quickly falls off, but it starts at 18 stacks and it is 10% less healing taken per stack. So you are fully heal immune for the first 8 seconds after the hit, followed by it slowly falling off until you're able to be healed again. The thing with this is that it is staggered by like 15 seconds or so, so you're going to have like 3 to 5 seconds where you are still slightly healing debuffed and you need to taunt off of the other tank, so there's a little bit of a need to use defensive cooldowns. Doing this as a Brewmaster Monk, playing with a Prot Warrior, neither of us really had any difficulty with this at all. Even on Mythic, it didn't really feel like it was particularly dangerous, and I think the gear they had us testing in was like sub-heroic raid level, maybe like very start of heroic raid for Mythic raid testing, so doesn't feel like it's going to be too challenging conceptually. I think it's pretty easy to wrap your head around. Very basic, what you would expect from a first boss. The sort of main mechanic he uses during his like primary phase is called Brutal Lashings. He basically picks a player and then they have a few seconds to like gather together with some buddies. It'll do a bunch of split damage to all of them, and then he'll start playing tug of war with those people. And the way it's supposed to work is that by having more people in the split, in the tug of war, it will pull less hard, and it'll also split that damage across more people, so just generally less dangerous. You have a minimum number of people that it has to hit. It has to hit at least 6 people, or he will like triple his damage for the rest of the fight, you know, instant wipe. So you do have to at least like soak it with a group of people. You can't just like have a hunter go off and feign or immune or whatever. I don't know, I was a little underwhelmed by the way that the pull fell off. It sort of didn't feel like when we had 20 people go stack in it, it didn't feel like it pulled any less hard than when we had like 8. And so I don't know if that was bugged or if it really is just like very small, the amount of grip end like falling off, but it felt very hard to actually stay out. Like as a Brewmaster Monk, I was having to roll like 3 times to not get gripped under the boss. And you don't want to get gripped under the boss, because if he grips you under him, it's supposed to do like several million DPS. Now maybe this is Brewmaster Monk stagger privilege, but I didn't feel like I took any damage getting gripped under the boss. I don't know if that mechanic was just not working correctly. I actually did not scour the log to make sure, you know, whether that was working correctly or if it was wrong. But either way, it didn't. I mean, I didn't see my stagger value suddenly spike up when I got gripped under the boss, so I just think it didn't work correctly. And so that was a little weird. When he hits 100 energy, he will then burrow under the ground and then start dashing back and forth super fast across the room and spawning adds. Some of the adds will fixate, little guys will fixate, and then there are big adds that are mythic only that have to be tanked. And that's exactly what you do. You tank them. All of the ads apply a pretty fast stacking, really dangerous bleed debuff. Like, unlike phase 1, which is pretty easy and safe as a tank, the intermission ads do a ton of damage. That bleed feels very overtuned. And the only real mechanic of this is you have to kill all the ads. The boss will charge around for a while. You have to dodge all of those charges. And then he will end his charge, and he will start roaring because he's hungry. He's mad and he's hungry, and he starts roaring. And he will also auto-attack, which is quite strange, so the tank has to beeline over there and start tanking the boss. And people have to pick up the corpses of the bugs and then run them over to the boss, use their extra action button to throw them in his mouth. This is all like fine, normal sounding, except that the bugs get feared by the boss if they're too close because he wants to eat them. So you can't drag the bugs close, so one tank has to pick up all those bugs and keep them kind of far away as they keep getting cleaved down by the raid. And then people have to use a lot of mobility skills to get, like, it's like 40 yard minimum that you have to keep the bugs at least 40 yards away from the boss. And so it really creates this situation where there's just so much movement required in this fight. This is an enormous boss arena, and sometimes the boss will end somewhat close to you, you know, like 40 yards away, and sometimes he'll be probably 80, 100 yards away, far end of a long platform. And, you know, credit to my channel manager for kind of recognizing that this fight kind of reminded her a lot of the first boss of Ny'alotha, Wrathion. I think that was a pretty good shout, because I remember that fight, you know, kind of thinking that I thought the mechanics on that fight were okay, but it was a fight that was just really ruined by the fact that the boss arena was like 4 football fields tied together, and it just kind of made like the amount of movement that was required just was so enormous that it really kind of ruined the boss fight. And I feel very similarly about this first boss, Ulgrax. I think the boss could be fine if the grip in phase 1 wasn't so harsh, and if the boss arena wasn't just so gigantic for running around with grabbing the bugs and running them like 70 yards to throw in his mouth. And you have to throw like 20, 30 bugs into his mouth. So it's like not a small feat for a raid group to like just be running over and over and over again with those bugs. You know, it's the first boss of a raid. I'm sure it'll be killed in like one pull by all of the major guilds. But it is kind of a boss that I think a lot of more normal people are going to be kind of irritated by just with how much movement is required. It does seem kind of disappointing, kind of lame. Definitely don't think that they're going to fix the movement requirements. Certainly they're not going to change the boss arena, but it is, I think, a little disappointing. All right, the second boss is the Bloodbound Horror, and this boss kind of has 2 tank mechanics. The main tank mechanic, the phase 1 tank mechanic, is that he will vomit on the tank and a big frontal cone. Everyone who gets hit by this vomit will then be kind of able to see the beyond, and there are ads down in the beyond, and so you do actually want to hit half the raid with that vomit. It doesn't really do that much damage. You hit that group of people, about 10 people or so, with the vomit, and everybody goes down. They're able to see the ads, and you have 40 seconds to basically kill the ads that are downstairs in the Great Beyond or whatever. There are like 3 types of ads. There's one that just kind of does random damage to people, one that spawns little mini ads that just walk toward the boss, and if they get to the boss, they explode, and then one that will try to shield the boss. So for the tank, your job really is just to kind of pick up the ad that shields the boss. You just kick it, and then it becomes a normal ad. Nothing else has a threat table. And you just basically cleave everything down. This is complicated by the second tank mechanic, which is controlled by the tank that is currently tanking the boss, the one that's not down in the beyond. The boss will, after about 15 seconds or so of sending everybody down, he'll spawn 2 lines that rotate around the room clockwise very slowly, but very deadly. They do like infinite million damage, just they instantly kill anybody who touches them. And so it's like kind of on the group to position themselves while they're in the downstairs, and then also the tank in the upstairs to position themselves and coordinate so that those lines will not be pushing people off of ads until, you know, like too early. And that's pretty much all there is to tanking this boss, really, is just like spitting on people, going down, killing the ads, and then if you're not the tank that's just been spit on, positioning the boss so that his sides will allow the downstairs group the maximum amount of time to cleave those ads down before they get swept away by the lines. I don't really like this fight all that much. I think it's kind of lame. The only other mechanic that really exists in this fight is after he's done that twice, he will then hit 100 energy, and then he'll do this like 60-yard scream. Everyone has to run at 60 yards, 61 plus yards away from the boss, or they'll get hit for like 20 million damage. That's one big explosion, and then everybody runs back in, and that's basically all there is to it. Then you repeat. The only other mechanic that's really going on in this fight is that there's like pools around the arena, and those do 20% of your health per tick. I think as shadow damage, so you definitely don't want to get ticked by those. But other than that, that's pretty much all there is to this fight. Can't say I'm a big fan. This is maybe the worst fight of the tier for me. This is the second boss, so I didn't really have like super high hopes, but I would say just generally speaking, I was pretty underwhelmed by this boss in the chance that I got to see it. Now this is followed up by what I consider the boss of the tier, Sikran, Captain of the Sureki. This boss is fantastic. I think if it weren't the third boss of the raid, I'm doing a little prediction here. I think if this weren't the third boss of the raid, I think everybody would saying that this is like the best boss of the tier, one of the better bosses in quite some time. The tank mechanic is actually kind of interesting. The boss will basically do 2 casts of Expose in a row and then follow that with Phase Lunge. I believe from talking with my warrior co-tank that the Phase Lunge, which deals a lot of shadow damage and some physical damage, is actually spell reflectable. You can't reflect the damage, but I think you can deflect it. Well, so that's pretty significant damage reduction. But basically it just goes like 2 big physical hits, which one tank takes, and then the other tank is able to tank or taunt during the Phase Lunge, and it'll swap to them and they take the Phase Lunge. And then they hold the boss until the next combo, and it's pretty simple, like a AA and then B and then BBA. What I think is more interesting about this boss, and I think is kind of indicative of the more interesting bosses in this raid, is that the tank's real job in this fight is to position the boss correctly. And the way that this boss works basically is he will kind of mark groups of people that have to run out, and then he will dash to them and leave behind little ghosts. And then he'll do a second mechanic where he marks people and shoots lines out at them. And so the people who get the line shot out at them have to detonate the ghosts, or the ghosts will all detonate when the boss hits 100 energy, and that'll do like a raid wipe. So you kind of have to stagger that out each time the lines go out. The ghosts go out first. Those have to be dropped in a kind of a formation, and then the lines have to be blasted through the ghosts. Pretty cool concept. I think it's really, really like fascinating visually, very, very like interesting from a raid design standpoint. And then on Mythic, the way that this gets more complicated is the ghosts can't be within 5 yards of each other. They will instantly wipe the raid. And then also on both Heroic and Mythic, they can't, like, when he's running out and dashing out and putting the ghosts out, that can't pass through anybody or it'll leave behind extra ghosts. So, combined with the Mythic mechanic, that'll almost certainly drop to within 5 yards of each other. I really like this mechanic, this whole series of mechanics, this whole fight, really. I like it a lot. I think it's really, really well done. And then his only other mechanic basically is when he hits, I guess, he has a bit of dodgeable damage, that's fine, but when he hits 100 energy, he will do like a really big burst of raid-wide damage and then detonate all the remaining ghosts, which will do even more. This is a lot of big tax on the healers, a lot of pressure put on the healers to like keep up, but I think, generally speaking, a lot of the damage is very manageable. This is definitely a fight where a very skilled group is going to be able to control it and like clear this boss, I think, fairly quick, but for uncoordinated groups, it can be like a real bone grinder. And it's just very, very satisfying when people are doing all the mechanics correctly and the boss is going very smoothly. It's just really, really good. Definitely one of my favorite fights that I've seen in quite some time, and at least thus far in testing, I would say for me, boss of the tier. Okay, the next boss is called Rasha'nan, and I would say it's visually kind of interesting. It is a bridge boss. It kind of moves around a couple of times throughout the fight, and it tends to move in the opposite direction from where players are standing, so you do have a little bit of control over where it will move. It kind of does a staggered movement. We'll get to that in a bit. So the main tank mechanic is just basically, it'll do this very fast cast, I think too quick of a cast, actually, and it'll do a mixture of physical and magic damage, and then a significant amount of the damage that's not mitigated will be dealt as a damage over time effect, and that can stack. You just taunt swap it, it's pretty basic, but it does sort of have that kind of more interesting mechanic of you need to mitigate as much as you possibly can of the upfront hit so that you have a much smaller damage over time effect later. That's pretty interesting. This is made a little bit more complicated by the fact that at least in the first round of testing, the heroic round, Brewmaster Monks, I mean technically any tank, but Brewmaster Monks were kind of the main one, could dodge the physical component of the hit, and so they would literally take no damage from the physical component of the damage over time. That was maybe not intended. I liked it. I thought it was pretty cool. I definitely would prefer it that way, but obviously, maybe a bit too much of an advantage for monks. I think the most interesting mechanic of this fight is that the boss will spawn a couple of lines on players, and you have to look at them and visually identify. They will very clearly indicate on the person who has them whether they're going to spew poison out to the right or the left. And so the people who have those lines will have to either go to the far left side of the group or to the far right side of the group and cause that poison wall to be blasted in that direction, because once those debuffs detonate, they will cause a gigantic wall of poison to go out the wrong, in the direction that they're going to go. And as you can see from some of the footage, I'll make sure I have some of this in here. It can be very funny if the people go on the exact opposite side, and now everybody's getting hit by 2 tidal waves made out of poison. Throughout the fight, the boss will move around the arena, and when she does, she'll jump away a bit, jumping away from the group. You have to chase after her and interrupt her once, and then chase after some more, and then she'll do kind of like the first boss, she'll do a targeted ground effect thing where she'll do a tug of war, and so everybody has to stand in that to make it not pull as hard. If you only have a couple of people in it, you'll basically just get launched off the platform instantly, and then you pretty much repeat the fight from there, just again and again. There are some adds in this fight as well to cleave down, but that's pretty much all there is to it. The next fight is Bloodtwister Ovi'nax, and to be honest, he was a little forgettable for me from the first round of testing. His main tank mechanic is that he will kind of do a big damage over time effect on the tank that detonates after I think 8 seconds here. And it'll do extra damage based on how much health is missing from the tank. So you kind of have this incentive to backload some healing right before that burst pops. But basically you have kind of a big long window to use defensive cooldowns and mitigate as much damage as possible. For Brewmaster Monk in particular, it's very, very easy to Celestial Brew a few seconds before it explodes and top yourself up, and it's pretty much a non-mechanic, kind of another mechanic in this raid that really favors Brewmaster Monk. And other than that, this is another fight where positioning is really the main tank mechanic, because that's just a basic taunt swap and you heal yourself pretty easy. Instead, positioning is really what it's all about here. So there are sort of 3 sections of this fight, 3 sections of the boss arena, and when the boss hits 100 energy, which he starts out very close to 100 energy, he will run over to one of the corners in that area and gobble up some fancy goo or something, and then it'll start kind of oozing out a gross black sludge into that third of the room. And there are eggs throughout the room that will spawn different adds. If the eggs get touched by the black goo, then the adds get empowered. They get a lot, either they're not CCable, or they're a lot more deadly, or they can't be interrupted, just a lot more dangerous. So you have this incentive to use the boss mechanic to hatch the eggs and kill the adds before they get empowered by the black goo. And that's basically all there is to this fight. You just kind of move him around the room, doing the 3 sections of the room, making him empower one after another, and hopefully not letting him buff up any of his adds. Again, as I said, I think there's probably a lot of complexity to this fight. It probably is a good fight, but at least from testing, I found it to be kind of just okay. We'll just say just okay. And then here we have the 6th fight of the raid, Nexus-Princess Ky'veza, and just like Sikran, Captain of the Sureki, something about these ones that are divisible by 3, this was an absolute banger of a fight. This fight was really, really cool. It was yet another fight where tank positioning, I think, is much more the real mechanic of the fight than the actual quote-unquote tank mechanic. And the way that this fight works is that for the tank mechanic, you just kind of have a big tank combo. It is what it is. She'll slash the tank, you taunt swap, the end. The real tank mechanic is that she will throw out lines onto people that will leave behind ghosts. Just like Sikran, Captain of the Sureki, you leave behind ghosts. Then she will also do another cast that causes both her and all of the ghosts that are out in the room to summon a big portal that sucks people in toward them and does massive amounts of damage if you get too close. So the way that you have to structure this as a group is you have to have the people who are targeted by the lines, by the, dropping the ghosts, They have to run out in sort of a pattern, and then you have to tank the boss kind of on the opposite side of the room so that the boss and the 3 ghosts will all kind of pull people in opposite directions and basically make everyone equilibrialize, pulled all apart from all of the 3 or 4, however many portals it is. Because you really don't want to get pulled into any of those portals. That's crucial. This seems like it's going to be made more complicated on Mythic by the fact that there will be some additional ghosts. We'll call those phantasms. Ghost type 2. There will be some phantasms that you have to have the boss like dash through when she's dashing out to throw out those ghosts. And if you don't dash through those, then they'll do like a raid-wide detonation when the boss hits 100 energy. And so that seems like it's going to be made like quite a bit more complicated to position the boss correctly so that it's still possible to draw the correct pattern with the players who are targeted by like dropping the ghosts on the ground, and then also having the boss in the right position so that you're getting kind of pulled by all of the different portals at the same time. Seems like it's going to be a really, really fun and difficult fight. I'm very excited about it. And then there is a phase 2 to this fight. It kind of combines a pretty classic style of like boss jumps to the middle of the room and channels for a while and you have to walk around areas in a pattern, but then it also includes the Farok lines as well, the Farok phase 1 lines, so you have both of those happening at the same time. I found that to be pretty fun and very interesting visually, and so I think this is, if I had to pick a second fight that, is a potential, like, fight of the tier, I think Nexus-Princess Ky'veza is, like, kind of my second option as fight of the tier. The Silken Court is the penultimate boss, the boss before Queen Ansurak, and we haven't gotten to test Queen Ansurak, but the Silken Court is the 7th boss, and the mythic mechanic is pretty insane. I don't even want to think about that right now. But the main tank mechanic really is just like a very basic taunt swap. You have 2 bosses that you're fighting at a time, Anub'arash and Skein Spinner Takaj. In phase 1, Anub'arash will just do just a very basic taunt swap, slam on the tank. And Skein Spinner Taraj in the first phase will do a poison bolt on the main tank that she's got threat on. You can dispel it. It is a poison dispel, so a lot of the tanks can remove that from themselves. She does kind of spam cast it though, and it's more about the upfront damage. The damage over time really isn't like that huge, but it is, free damage removal, so you can do that. You taunt swap them back and forth as they do their mechanic every 15 or 20 seconds. It's pretty basic. In phase 2, that turns into a Void Bolt, deals shadow damage, no longer poison dispellable, so you're relying on a healer to do that, but again, not really all that important to do. And the thing is, that's kind of all that's going on for the tanks. Skein Spinner Takaj is a caster, so you're not able to control her positioning, and Anub'arash, for the most part, you are probably trying to tank them together. You don't have a downside for tanking them together on normal and heroic. On Mythic, the mechanic for Mythic is quite a bit more complicated. There are basically some marks that go out on players who are close to one boss or the other. If you touch somebody who has the other mark, you instantly die. If you aren't within 15 yards of the bosses, you instantly die. It becomes quite a lot more difficult. And these are marks that persist through death, so I do think this is going to be one of the most unforgiving fights they've ever made. Again, don't want to think about it. There is a transition phase where you have to break a shield on the first boss. We saw that in testing quite a lot of times. We got through that, I think, maybe once or a handful of times. Then there's a second intermission where you basically have the same thing, except it's with the other boss. At least during Heroic, on Heroic, the boss that's doing the intermission phase will be active and attackable, but basically just doing a raid-wide dodge mechanic, and the other boss will despawn entirely or disappear entirely. I don't know how that'll change on Mythic. Maybe you'll have to actually fight that boss throughout, but I kind of doubt it. And then I didn't get a chance to see phase 3 with the group I was testing with, but that's okay. It's from the dungeon journal. It just sort of seems like they're kind of doing both of their sets of mechanics at the same time. I will say that I thought the phase 2 mechanic was pretty interesting. It reminded me a bit of Kurag Grim Totem from Vault of the Incarnates. When he's in his Earth phase, you have those circles of Earth that you have to dodge. There were a lot of overlapping Earth circles that you had to dodge, and I thought that was pretty cool. But generally speaking, I actually thought that this fight, at least on Heroic, was a bit of a snoozer as the tank. Finally, Queen Ansurak, we have absolutely no idea what her deal is. We can read the dungeon journal, but we haven't gotten to test her. Just from looking at it, it seems like her tank mechanic is that she will do One like sort of a combo, 2-hit combo on the tank. 1 hit goes on one tank, 1 hit goes on the other tank. And then there's a lot of adds in this fight as well. We don't know. Again, from the Dungeon Journal, it sort of seems like there's like a lot of add cleave in one phase, and then it's more single target throughout the rest of the fight. But you know, we don't know. Maybe there is more cleave to be done throughout the fight. No, obviously the raid isn't finished, testing is still ongoing, and at least as of the time of recording this, we have 2 more days of testing to test the remaining 4 bosses that we haven't tested yet on Mythic difficulty. That would be Rasha'nan, Bloodtwister Ovi'nax, Nexus-Princess Ky'veza, and the Silken Court. You know, we've tested the first 3, but not the next 4 on Mythic. So there is plenty that can change. Maybe they even retest some of these bosses. Maybe they retest the Ulgrax fight. You know, that didn't really feel like it was right. We'll just kind of have to see. With all of that being said, I do think the raid is looking pretty good and pretty polished. There are definitely a lot of familiar mechanics in here, a lot of stuff where, you know, they've reheated some leftovers, but they've done so in a way that I think works pretty well. I found a couple of bosses a little annoying. The first 2 bosses really stood out as being pretty annoying. I think the Silken Court could be like an all-time difficult boss on Mythic, but as always, anything can change. Either way, I think this is all very exciting. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.